from their own worst impulses. It records every failure. And that unflinching honesty does something important for the reader. It makes the story real in a way that sanitized versions never could. Because we recognize this. We know what it looks like when a household fractures and when relationships collapse under the weight of unmet expectations and desperate decisions. We've watched it happen, and in some cases, we've lived it ourselves in our own lives. The story we're looking at today is one of the most human stories in all of Scripture. It takes place inside of a single household over the course of several decades, and it involves three women whose lives intersected with one of the most significant figures in the ancient world in three completely different ways, each of them carrying a different kind of pain, each of them leaving behind a different kind of legacy that most Bible readers have never fully traced. This video is about the wives of Abraham, their heartbreak and their healing, their prayers and their pain, their ultimate legacy. Because everyone leaves a story behind them when they pass from this life to the next. And the story these three women left has been reverberating through the halls of history for nearly 4,000 years. Most of the people who claim to know it really truly only know half the story. Let's start at the beginning, and I mean the very beginning. If we don't understand where these people came from, we're going to miss what makes their story so remarkable. Before we get too far into this video about the wives of Abraham, I want to let you know that my book, Dynasty of Slaves, is available right now. It's actually finally done. It follows the family of Abraham from Genesis 12 all the way through the Exodus, and it connects the dots between the archaeology and the Bible in ways that have never been published before. If you've been watching this channel, you already know the serious depth of research that went into this project. It's available now in ebook, softcover, and hardcover, and you can search Dynasty of Slaves on Amazon to find it, or you can click the link in the description right below this video. So go grab it now as a favor to me, and also, one more favor, don't forget to leave a review to help other people find it too. All right, back to the video. Somewhere in the early second millennium BC, in a sophisticated urban center called Ur of the Chaldees in lower Mesopotamia, a woman named Sarai married a man named Abram. What we know about her from Genesis 11 can be summed up in two pieces of information. She's his wife, and she's barren. She cannot have children. That's the entire introduction. Name, relationship, and the crisis that's going to drive the next several decades of her life. Ur wasn't some quiet pastoral village on the edge of the ancient world either. Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s found royal tombs of staggering complexity, evidence of advanced metallurgy, elaborate burial practices, and human sacrifice accompanying the deaths of royals, with servants killed and interred alongside their masters. Dominating the skyline was a massive ziggurat complex dedicated to Nana, the moon god. This is what Joshua 24 means when he says that Abraham's family served other gods beyond the river. Lunar cult, ziggurat worship, a fully developed cosmology explaining the world in terms of complete divine powers. That's the world Sarai grew up inside, and she walked away from it all, without the text recording a single word of hesitation on her part. When God speaks to Abram and tells him to leave for a land he can't yet name, Sarai goes with him. She's with him every step of the way. Hebrews 11 puts Abraham in the hall of faith for walking out of Ur toward a destination he couldn't identify, which is absolutely deserved. But Sarai was walking right there beside him the whole way. Now, there's something about her story that almost nobody talks about, and we're going to start there because it reframes everything that follows. When God renames Sarai in Genesis 17, most readers treat it like a formality, a slight variation in a name she already had, and so they read right past it toward the circumcision ceremony and the promise of Isaac and the laugh that Sarah will later deny having when the angel shows up at the tent. But the name isn't a formality. Sarai becomes Sarah, and Sarah is a royal title in West Semitic languages, a word meaning princess or noblewoman, a designation of rank and consequence in the world these people actually inhabited. God isn't giving her a prettier name or offering her a consolation prize after decades of barrenness and displacement. He's designating her, publicly and permanently, with a title that carries genuine weight in the language of her world. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, commissioning monuments and trade expeditions that rivaled anything her male predecessors built. Cleopatra governed the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world, and she held it together through political intelligence longer than most men managed the seat. These weren't background characters in someone else's story, and neither is Sarah. Genesis 17:16 says, "Kings of people shall be of her," and she receives that designation while she's still barren, before the title has any visible evidence behind it. The barrenness isn't a subplot, it's the engine the entire narrative runs on. The Ugaritic literature discovered at Ras Shamra in 1929 gives us a window into the mythological world surrounding this family. And running through that literature is a motif that the original audience of Genesis would have recognized immediately, which is the story of a woman of high status with a barren womb who receives a divine promise of a son. Abraham's world knew the shape of that story and leaned in expecting it to resolve the way it always did. And then God made them wait 25 years. The promise comes in Genesis 12, and Isaac isn't born until Genesis 21, long past the point where any natural explanation remains available. So that by the time Isaac arrives, Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90, and she laughs when she hears it. The miracle can't be explained any other way, and that's exactly the point. Then there's Egypt. And this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Famine drives the family south in Genesis 12, and before they cross the border, Abraham pulls Sarai aside and tells her to say he's his sister rather than his wife. It's technically defensible because Genesis 20 clarifies she's his half-sister, but that doesn't change what Abraham is doing, which is putting his wife between himself and his fear, rather than trusting God who called him out of Ur. She goes into Pharaoh's household, and the text records nothing of her experience there, no feelings and no prayers and no protests. And then God responds with plagues until Pharaoh figures out what's happening and he sends him away. God protects her when her husband doesn't. And Egyptian administrative records confirm the vulnerability of her position wasn't theoretical. Taking a foreign woman of apparent status into a royal household was a well-documented practice in this world. Genesis 22 ends on the mountain in Moriah, with the wood and the fire and the knife raised, and the boy and the ram caught in the thicket. And Genesis 23 opens with the information that Sarah was 127 years old when she died. She's the only woman in all of Scripture whose age at death is recorded, and the text is treating her passing with the same biographical gravity it gives to the great figures of the covenant line. Abraham mourns her, and then he negotiates with the Hittites of Hebron for the cave of Machpelah, paying 400 shekels of silver at full commercial price, refusing when they offer it as a gift, because he won't bury his wife in borrowed ground. That transaction is the first piece of the promised land that the family actually owns by legal purchase, and Sarah gets there first. The Hittite legal framework of that negotiation follows known ancient Near East commercial conventions closely enough that scholars have pointed to it as evidence of authentic historical memory embedded in the text. It's not a story that was made up later on. She came out of Ur and walked into the unknown alongside a man following a voice she hadn't heard, bore the weight of his fear without the text recording a single complaint, and waited 25 years for a promise that seemed to be dying with every passing year. When she finally died, the man who'd failed her more than once paid full price to put her in the ground, and that would belong to her people forever. That's Sarah. She's a covenant princess. She's the mother of kings, and she's the first chapter of a story that's about to get significantly more complicated. Before we get into Hagar's story, we need to establish something that most readers completely miss. Because if you miss this, you're going to read this whole section of Genesis as a soap opera, when it's actually something with much more legal and social weight than that. When Sarai gives Hagar to Abram in Genesis 16, the text uses a specific word to describe what she's doing. She's giving her to him as his wife, not as a servant still, not as a concubine, his wife. That's formal legal language, and every person in the household understood exactly what it meant and what it changed. Hagar has been elevated. Her son will have a legal claim on this household, and Sarai, in her desperation, has handed over more ground than she probably realized. There's a collection of ancient legal documents called the Nuzi tablets, discovered in northern Iraq in the 1920s, and it's written in Akkadian. These tablets give us marriage contracts from the exact cultural world Abraham and Sarah were operating in. What these contracts show us is that a barren wife providing her husband a surrogate from her own servants was a legally recognized and socially expected practice, actually written into marriage agreements in some cases. Sarai isn't going rogue here. She's not making it up. She's following the script her culture handed her. And that's what makes it so tragic, of course, because the script works exactly as designed, and then it immediately destroys everything. The household falls apart. Hagar is Egyptian, and there's a reasonable case that she came into the household during the Genesis 12 Egypt episode, which means that she's been watching Abram and Sarai and their strange relationship with their God for years before any of this happens. She's been inside this story long enough to watch God deliver them out of Egypt, watch the wealth accumulate, watch the promise go unfulfilled year after year. And then Sarai hands her to Abram. The legal terminology of a wife is applied to her. She conceives. And Genesis 16:4 tells us she despised her mistress immediately. We shouldn't understand this as petty jealousy. That's a woman who understands her new legal position and what it means for the son that she's carrying. She knows what the word wife means. Sarai knows what it means too, which is exactly why the conflict detonates so fast and so completely. Two women who both understand the legal and social stakes, and only one of them is going to be able to hold that ground. Sarai deals harshly with her, and Hagar runs. She's pregnant and she's alone, and she's headed south on the road to Shur, which is the ancient road toward Egypt, almost certainly going back home where she came from. And that's where the angel of the Lord finds her, sitting by a spring in the wilderness. And he asks her two questions. He asks, "Where did you come from? And where are you going?" She answers the first one and not the second, because she doesn't have an answer to the second one. She just knows that she's running. What happens next is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire book of Genesis. The angel speaks to her, makes promises over her son, tells her his name will be Ishmael, and Hagar responds by giving God a name. She calls him El Roy, the God who sees, and she becomes the first human being in the biblical record to give God a personal name based on her own direct encounter with him. It's not Abraham, it's not Sarai, not any of the patriarchs. This Egyptian woman alone in the wilderness is the first person in Scripture to name God from her personal experience, and the text records it without embarrassment or qualification. And she goes back. She has the boy, and for a season, the household holds together until Isaac arrives and everything fractures again in Genesis chapter 21. Sarah sees Ishmael mocking Isaac at the weaning feast and goes to Abraham with a demand that would have been legally explosive in their world. She asks to cast out this bondwoman and her son. The Newsy tablets are explicit that a surrogate wife who has borne a son cannot be cast out. It's legally prohibited in the very framework Sarah used to justify the arrangement in the first place. And God tells Abraham to listen to her anyway. The legal framework of the ancient Near East says one thing and God overrides it, making a sovereign decision about the covenant line that supersedes the customs of the surrounding culture, while he also makes it clear that he hasn't forgotten Hagar or Ishmael. Abraham sends them away with just bread and a skin of water that doesn't last long in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water runs out, and Hagar puts the boy under a shrub and walks away because she can't watch him die. And the text says God was with the boy as he grew, which isn't describing a one-time rescue. It's describing an ongoing relationship with a boy who carries the name that means God heard him when no one else did. And so you have Hagar, who names God the God who sees, and then God names Ishmael the God who hears. And we see both of those things fulfilled in the nature of God, the character of God, when they're in the wilderness of Beersheba. The wilderness of Beersheba is real and identifiable geography, with ancient wells excavated and documented, and the road to Shur a known ancient trade route with archaeological evidence going back well before Abraham's time. It's a real place where a real woman sat down in the dirt because she couldn't watch her son die, and where a real God showed up and opened her eyes to the water she hadn't seen. That's where Hagar's story ends in the text. The first personal name anyone ever gave to God, and a son whose name is a testimony to the fact that God was listening even when no one else was. But if you've never read through Genesis in one sitting, you know that the narrative builds to an almost unbearable intensity through the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. And then Sarah dies and Abraham mourns her, and Isaac finds Rebekah in one of the most tender love stories in all of Scripture. And you feel like the great drama of Abraham's life has reached its resolution. The covenant is secure, the heir is settled, and then Genesis 25 opens with a line most readers slide right past. It says, Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. No preamble, no explanation, no indication of when this happened or how they met. Just a matter of fact statement that this man who buried his first wife and sent away his second took another wife, and she gave him 6 sons. And the text lists their descendants with the same genealogical seriousness it gives to the covenant line. Before we get into who those sons become, we need to talk about something that's lived inside the text itself for centuries. Genesis 25, verse 1 calls Keturah Abraham's wife, clear and straightforward. The same word used for Sarah and the same word used for Hagar. But 1 Chronicles 1:32 calls her his concubine. Same woman, same sons listed in the same order, different term entirely. And the Bible doesn't resolve the discrepancy or acknowledge that any tension exists. In the ancient world, that difference wasn't a minor semantic quibble. A wife and a concubine were distinct legal categories with real consequences for status and inheritance, and the terminology determined what your children could expect when their father died. The text making room for both terms around the same woman is genuinely interesting, and it's not just a copyist's inconsistency. The rabbinic tradition couldn't leave it alone either. Some sources propose that Keturah and Hagar are actually the same person, that after Sarah died, Abraham went and found Hagar and brought her back and married her properly this time. It's a minority position that the text does not explicitly support, but the instinct behind it is theologically interesting, because what the rabbis were reaching toward is the idea that God's provision for Hagar didn't end in the wilderness of Beersheba, and that the story wasn't finished when Abraham sent her away. What is interesting is that all three women share the same word, Ishisha, or Isha, which means wife. They're all Abraham's wives, but each also carries a separate title. Sarah, something like Queen Mother when her name is changed. Hagar carries the name bondservant for years after that, and Keturah carries the title concubine. What I find interesting about that is they all share the same position as Abraham's wives, but they don't have the same status. The text is clearly saying that while Sarah and Hagar and Keturah are the same position, Sarah has a different status. She's much higher on the hierarchy. Now back to Keturah's name. In Hebrew, it connects to the root word for incense or fragrance, and that matters because of where her sons ended up. The Arabian incense trade routes running through the territories her sons will settle are among the most economically significant corridors in the ancient Near East, with frankincense and myrrh moving northward from southern Arabia toward Egypt and Mesopotamia along routes connecting the ancient world's great civilizations. Some scholars read her name as a geographic and commercial signal embedded in the text, which would mean she isn't just a comfort wife for a grieving old man. She's a connection to a geopolitical world that Abraham's descendants are going to be entangled with for centuries. Fascinating enough, my first video on this channel was about the descendants of Joktan, who also settled in that same area and are known to be involved in the incense trade as well. The most interesting son to follow is Midian. I've covered the Midianite connection to Moses and Jethro in a previous video, so we won't spend much time on that here. But Keturah's grandson becomes Moses' father-in-law, a priest who declares in Exodus 18 that the Lord is greater than all gods, and then he counsels Moses on governing Israel in ways Moses actually implements. The grandson of Keturah shaping the infrastructure of the covenant nation from completely outside the covenant line. But there's another Midianite moment that doesn't get connected to Keturah nearly enough. In Genesis 37, a company of Midianite traders passes through at exactly the right moment to carry Joseph down into Egypt out of that pit. Their camels loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, which is appropriate for where they settled. Abraham's descendants through Keturah, carrying Abraham's descendant through Sarah into this very slavery God will use to preserve the ancient world, where Hagar came from. The family keeps intersecting with itself across generations without any of the participants knowing it. And the thread runs straight back to this woman most Bible readers have never spent more than 5 minutes talking about. Then there's one more moment before we close out Abraham's story, and it belongs to Ishmael as much as it belongs here. But it's the last time that we see the full picture of what Abraham's family actually looked like at the end of his life. Genesis 25, verse 9 tells us that when Abraham died, Isaac and Ishmael buried him together in the cave of Machpelah, right beside Sarah. Ishmael had been sent away decades earlier, built his own life in the wilderness, fathered 12 sons who became 12 princes, and had no legal obligation to be standing at his father's grave. But he came back anyway. He stood beside the brother who inherited everything and put his father in the ground, and the text records it without the tension of drama or any suggestion of conflict between them. That's how Ishmael exits the biblical narrative. Present, honoring his father, standing beside Isaac without a single word of bitterness recorded. I can imagine that Hagar may have had some influence on his maturity in this picture. Now, before we close out, let's pull the camera back for a moment and look at what we actually have here. We have three women, three completely different experiences of life inside one of the most consequential households in human history. Sarah is the covenant princess who walked out of one of the ancient world's greatest cities on nothing but her husband's word, waited 25 years for a promise that seemed to be dying with every passing year, endured things the text doesn't fully describe, and never had the text record a single word of complaint from her. Hagar, she's the Egyptian, handed over by her mistress, elevated to a legal term that changed everything. cast out in violation of the very law that elevated her, and then met by God twice in the wilderness, an encounter so personal that she became the first human being in Scripture to give God a name, a personal name, from her own human experience with him. And then you have Keturah, who appears after the funeral without explanation, whose status the biblical tradition itself couldn't agree on between wife and concubine, whose sons quietly became the traders and priests and counselors that the covenant people would depend on for generations without ever connecting the thread back to her. God moves through all three of these stories without abandoning any of them. And that's worth sitting with because it keeps happening across the whole of Scripture. It isn't just these three women. Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God with no Israelite lineage and no explanation for how he got there. Rahab is a Canaanite woman whose faith shows up in Hebrews 11 alongside Abraham and Sarai. Ruth is a Moabite who ends up in the genealogy of David and ultimately of Christ. Jethro is a Midianite priest, a grandson of Keturah, who speaks more clearly about the supremacy of God in one moment than most of Israel manages across generations. Naaman is a Syrian commander who goes home from the Jordan River healed and confessing that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. The sailors in Jonah cry out to God and make vows while the prophet of God is asleep in the hold. This thread runs through the whole biblical narrative, and most people never notice it because they're reading the covenant line only, and they're skipping everyone else standing adjacent to it. But here's what that thread is actually telling us. The covenant line is the spine of the redemptive story, the specific through line that runs from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to David and then to Jesus Christ himself. And that line is real and legitimate, and the whole of Scripture is organized around it. But the God of that covenant is not domesticated by it. He doesn't stay inside the lines his own people drew around him. He keeps showing up in places and among people that the covenant community assumed were outside of his attention, and the text keeps recording it without apology. Abraham himself is the original outside the line story. He's a Chaldean from a moon cult city, from a family that served other gods before God found him and called him out. And out of that man, God built a nation and a covenant and a promise that's still reverberating 4,000 years later. Which brings us back to these three women and what their stories are actually about at the deepest level. If there's one thing common to us all, it's the pain that follows bad choices, faithless decisions, and unanswered prayers, mistreatment by someone you trusted, or being discarded by someone you loved. These three women give us three perspectives of pain and unmet expectations, and three examples of God's faithfulness to us in all of it. If you're in this season today, God is not distant. He's the God that elevates a shepherd's wife to become a queen, who sees the servant girl alone in the desert, and who gives generational legacy to a woman who seems like only a footnote in history. And that same God is with you